Yo, what's good, everyone? Welcome to another episode of the Terminator Training Show. I'm Kevin Smith. Today's episode is going to be back to the Q&A theme with this week's Instagram Q&As, which I got a lot of them. Some of the questions I'll answer today will be repeats that I also answer on Instagram. Other ones are ones that I didn't get to on Instagram. So it'll be a good mix of both. And I will go through and try and provide as much nuance as possible. I'll also try to get to as many questions as I can. By the way, this is just an obligatory notice. If I don't get to your question on Instagram or on here, that doesn't mean I am ignoring it or it's a bad question, although sometimes it is a bad question, not always. I just can only get to so many. And when I talk for too long to myself in the camera, I get really fatigued. So I try to keep these episodes around an hour, maybe a little bit longer. Last episode I did was a single topic episode and I talked for a little longer, but I also I plan an outline for those shows. So it's a little bit easier for my brain to work later in the episode. However, I probably looked at my outline 2 or 3 times that last episode. I kind of just, when I wrote it all out, it jogged my memory enough where I could talk about each phase and whatnot. So although I had my outline right next to me, I probably only scrolled down and read, 2 or 3 things the entire time, but I had a really good time recording that episode. So hopefully if you guys haven't listened to that, it's the last episode 120, where I just talk about my entire Q course, SFAS, all the way through the end of the Q course experience, including a little bit before I joined the Army, and just a trip down memory lane. And hopefully you guys enjoyed that. It's definitely got a lot of downloads in the first couple of days that it's been out. So appreciate you guys tuning into that. Hopefully it was a entertaining episode. And hopefully for those who haven't listened to it yet, I also embedded some lessons in there on things that I did that I would do differently, as well as just some things to expect if you are about to go the Special Forces route, whether you're going in as an X-ray or not. So anyway, get into the Q&As today. Let's get started. I got a few questions about carbohydrates, so I'm just going to start with this one question about it, and hopefully it answers other questions that also included carbohydrates in them. Seemed to be a big theme this week. So first question, what is your preferred type of carbohydrate, e.g. sugar, starch, and fiber, and what foods have them? So my preferred types of carbohydrates may be a little different from what yours may be. However, the main reason I choose certain carbohydrates that I'll get into here in a second is due to ease of digestion and their benefits on my personal performance, as well as performance of a lot of my clients that I teach these types of things. So, carbs seem pretty simple. Just eat foods with carbohydrates in them, but there are better sources of carbohydrates for certain situations. And there are also better and worse types of carbohydrates for certain people. So for example, I personally do not digest wheat-based and whole grain-based products nearly as well as I digest foods like rice and other rice-based products, potatoes, sweet potatoes, and berries and other types of fruit. Those are my best go-to, easiest digesting foods. I also eat quite a few bagels because not that bagels are ideal for health, but if I am for example, if I'm going to work out in 2 hours and I want to get a good solid breakfast in with 100 plus grams of carbs in it, instead of eating a bunch of oatmeal to get that carb, for example, or instead of eating a bunch of other grain-based products, that stuff really doesn't sit well with me. And also in general, if you're eating prior to training, you want faster digesting carbohydrates, which the thing to look out for ease of digestion, assuming that you don't have some sort of intolerance or inability to digest food. But either way, you want to look for carbohydrates with low fiber. And this is just around training. This is not all the time. It's not, just eat low fiber in general. It is specifically around training, especially before training, but also if you're going for optimization, you probably want low fiber carbohydrates post-training as well for fast digestion. That way they enter the bloodstream faster, they go into your glycogen stores faster, and you therefore will recover slightly faster. Not as important after training, but definitely important during training. If you eat a lot of fat and fiber prior to training, you are probably still digesting that food when you start training. And your body doesn't really want to focus on digestion and training at the same time, because your digestion requires a lot of blood flow to your digestive organs, and training requires a lot of blood flow to your working muscles to propel you for whatever you're doing for your training. Doesn't matter as much for like a lifting workout or something like that, but if you're doing any sort of conditioning, definitely something to consider. So those are my preferred sources of carbs. I also supplement with carbs. I use Vitargo, which is a fast-acting carbohydrate supplement, but you could also do something like any sort of cyclic dextrin, cluster dextrin, even Gatorade is totally fine to use right before your workout, intra-workout, post-workout. You can kind of mix it with whatever you want. Like this drink I have sitting next to me right here, I'm doing legs later, so I like to get some liquid carbs in along with my breakfast before a leg session, just because I perform a lot better when I eat a lot of carbs on lower body days, just because they're super fatiguing. They're very demanding training sessions. So this has a scoop of whey protein, like 25 grams of whey protein, and 2 scoops of Vitargo in it, which is about 70 grams of carbs. And it has some sodium in it as well, just for electrolytes, as well as, of course, water. So those are my go-tos. When the only really other carbs that I eat would be sourdough bread. I eat quite a bit of sourdough bread. Sourdough bread is just more easy digesting than most other forms of bread. And it's not quite, it's probably not easier digesting than like white bread, but it's just better for you health-wise than white bread. And sourdough bread's great. So you want to definitely search for like a higher quality sourdough bread, not like the stuff you buy in the regular bread aisle. It's better than nothing, but if you have access to a nice bakery or you can get more fresh sourdough bread at your grocery store, I would go with that. In regards to how much, I personally eat a lot of carbohydrates. Most of my clients also eat a lot of carbohydrates, but it's very individual. Some people do great on 150 grams of carbohydrates per day. I personally would waste away on 150 grams of carbohydrates per day, and I wouldn't feel very good. I just run better off higher carbohydrates. So I usually eat 400 to 600 grams, just depending on what my training looks like that day. So the main takeaway is a lot of people kind of don't understand what it means to like really eat plenty of carbohydrates to fuel their performance. And if you're doing, if you're just kind of a regular person who wants to get a little bit fitter and you go to the gym 3-4 days a week and maybe you do a little bit of low intensity cardio, you don't really need a ton of carbs. You absolutely can eat more carbs. You definitely can, but you don't have to crank the carbs like you would if you were on the other side of the fence, like you were training for 10, 12 plus hours per week. You're doing a lot of glycolytic training. So running intervals, tempo runs, high rep lifting, or really any sort of hypertrophy work, any sort of strength work, you're going to feel better when you eat more carbohydrates for strength work, even though they're usually in the lower rep range and you don't really tap into a ton of glycogen stores. Just anecdotally, people usually feel better when they're doing strength training with a higher carbohydrate intake. So that is what I would consider. As far as timing, it really depends. If you're eating low fiber carbs, you can eat an hour and a half prior to training. You can sip on some carbs as you go into training. Maybe if you're about to take a run, you're about to go for a tempo run or something like that, maybe have a goo packet 10 minutes prior. You don't really need intra run goo packets or anything like that if you're doing a shorter tempo run, but you definitely want a little bit of circulating glucose just before you step off. If you're doing longer runs, you want to consider using some goo packets, gummies, liquid carbohydrates, or a combination of all those things throughout your run. Usually anything over 75 minutes or so requires a little bit of carbohydrates in the quantities of 50 to 80 grams per hour, just depending on the person, their size, and what they can kind of handle without any sort of GI distress. So that takes a little bit of experimentation, but hopefully that gives you a good overview of carbs. 10 minutes into the episode, definitely got into the details with that one, but that should answer like 3 or 4 other questions that I got about carbohydrates yesterday too. So let's move on to the next question. Next question, who tends to do better in SFAS, older guys with more life experience or younger guys? I don't really have statistics to back this up, but in my experience, guys in their 20s, so mid to late 20s probably, are the most common successful selection candidates. So that's a little bit in between super young and older folks. I personally went at 22, so it definitely can be done at younger ages. There have been younger people than that who have gotten selected. But either way, regardless of what your age is, there's a lot of different variances between maturity levels. There are plenty of 30-year-olds, 35-year-olds who are very immature. There are plenty of 20-year-olds who are more mature than most other 20-year-olds. So, of course, physical fitness is number one, but at the same time, having some life experience and having some maturity is super important for your potential success, especially during team week, especially just for being able to control your stress levels and control your nervous energy and control your emotions, control the way you interact with people. So I would say so long as you're physically fit and so long as you're not a nutcase and you have aspirations to go to SFAS, send it. Go for it. Don't worry about your age. It's very possible, very doable for a variety of different people at a variety of different ages. So send it. Next question. What is your take on short, intense ruck intervals 2 to 3 times per week? I would really only use ruck intervals on a case-by-case basis. I have used ruck intervals and I've programmed ruck intervals for guys training for selection before, various different selections, but usually it is more in a fartlek manner and or sometimes it is more in a hill repeat manner than just doing intervals. And I definitely would not do ruck intervals 2 to 3 times per week. That's very, very intense. I wouldn't even run running intervals 2 to 3 times per week. You absolutely can get by without doing any ruck intervals, but if you are really struggling with gated events and stuff like that, you absolutely can throw in some ruck intervals. I would do some sort of fartlek. So say you're going for a 60-minute ruck, maybe first 10 minutes you just walk. The next 40 minutes you do 5 minutes of trotting, 5 minutes of walking, 5 minutes of trotting, 5 minutes of walking till you're like 10 minutes from being done. And then you kind of finish with a little cool down walk or something like that. That would be more of a ruck fartlek. You could also do ruck hill repeats where you go, 3, 4, 5 minutes on an incline. You could do this on a treadmill. I don't recommend doing most of your rucks on a treadmill, but if you don't have a great hill for this, the treadmill allows you to manage all the variables, the rest periods, the steepness, the speed, all that kind of stuff. So you could do it on a treadmill or you could do it outside. But I would do a few minutes uphill. You can either power walk it or you can go at a trot. Just go at a repeatable pace. Don't go all out on the first one and then slower on the second one and slower on the third one. Pick a pace that's like 7 to 8 RPE and be able to repeat it for however many intervals you do. And it really just depends on what distance you're going for to improve. But we'll say like a 12 miler, I would start with maybe 3 or 4 3-minute intervals and then maybe increase an interval or increase the duration of the interval every so often. But you don't necessarily have to do this every single week. The value of doing it on an incline is that it's way less impact. And you want to, when you're running with a ruck on, especially if you're doing intervals and you're doing a lot of ruck running, you want to look for ways to still make it really hard, which of course the hill is going to make it even harder than doing intervals on flat surface. But also the main advantage of the hill, I've talked about this a million times, but I'll talk about it again, is that it's less impact. So it's going to be easier to recover from. It's going to stress your joints a lot less, and you are still going to get a lot of value from it. But that all being said, does everyone need to do intervals? No. Do they serve a purpose for some people? Yes, absolutely. If you struggle with ruck running speed or gated ruck speed and your long rucks are not doing the job for you, or your short, faster rucks are not doing the job for you, then you absolutely can throw in some ruck intervals. However, I would not do it 2 to 3 times per week. That is excessive, especially if you're doing other training and you have other goals. Maybe if your goal is only rucking and you barely do any other training, I guess you could probably work your way up to 2 to 3 times per week. But I think it's a relatively arbitrary way to train, not necessary. If you want to ruck 3 times per week, say you're training for SMU selection or something like that, or there are cases where I would potentially have a selection candidate for a short period of time ruck 3 times per week, I would do something like a shorter, heavier ruck where you're just walking, maybe a hill repeat or a fartlek ruck, and a longer ruck where you maybe towards the end incorporate some running into that ruck as well, just to work on your longer duration ruck running. But these are things that I would do not year round. They're not things I would do for more than a couple of months at a time as you approach selection. And you want to really be mindful of how you're feeling, how you're recovering, how your joints are feeling, and making sure you're not overdoing it, because doing too much rucking is definitely a great way to just overtrain and put yourself into a deep recovery hole and really struggle. So some rucking, great. Tons of ruck running, not a great approach in my opinion. Next question, ideal amount of times to strength train per week if trying to increase rucking and running. So it depends. If your goal is to improve running and rucking and also get stronger, the answer would be different than it would be if your goal was mainly to get better at running and rucking, but you're using the lifting to support your running and rucking. So think improve at all 3 or just improve at 2 and use the lifting to support the other 2. So I'm assuming that you are probably looking to make at least strength, a little bit of strength and muscle gains, or at least maintain it, and also improve your rucking and running. So in that case, I would probably lift 3 to 4 times per week. 3 to 4 is usually a good number for pretty much anyone looking to do multiple things. Honestly, you could lift 3 to 4 times per week and make great strength and muscle gains basically forever too. You don't have to lift more than that. But in this situation, since you're going to be doing other training outside of your lifting, you also want to not train 5 days a week, 6 days a week, maybe 5, but probably not, probably 4 at the most. I would say in most cases 3. And the way I would split it would be either 3 full body days. Maybe you do 1 upper body focused full body day where you just touch on the legs a little bit. Then maybe you do 1 lower body full body day where you just touch on the upper body a little and it's mostly legs. And then maybe you do a balanced full body day, or maybe another upper body full body day, upper body focused full body day, just to allow some extra recovery for the lower body since you're getting a lot of volume on your lower body anyway from rucking and running. But that is the main way I'd split it up. If you want to do 4 days per week, you could do a upper lower split. You could do an anterior posterior split. You could do push pull legs, arms, shoulders. For that split, not necessarily what I would choose as my first option for this particular goal. But if you want to do that, it would be like Monday pull, Wednesday push, Friday legs, and then Saturday arms and shoulders, and repeat. Another option would be to do 2 upper body days, 1 lower body day. So you could do Monday, Wednesday, Friday, upper, lower, upper. That would also work out really well because, again, you're putting a lot of volume on your lower body from your running and rucking. So those are all options. You want to really monitor your recovery, how you're feeling. If you're making gains, then you're probably doing something right. If you are feeling banged up, or if you're kind of stalling out the entire time and just not feeling great, then you probably want to dial something back. And since your main goals are running and rucking, the first thing I would dial back would be the lifting volume. Not necessarily cut a day of lifting or anything like that, but I would drop a set from like all your compound lifts and see if you feel better. Volume in lifting is always going to be, in most cases, going to be more fatiguing than actual intensity. So you still want to train hard. But, if you're doing 15 sets per muscle group per week, especially for lower body, if you're doing anywhere near that for lower body, and you're also doing a lot of rucking and running, and you're training somewhat close to failure within 2 or 3 reps shy of failure, that is going to be more fatiguing than, say, cutting that volume in half, doing 6 to 8 sets per muscle group per week, maybe a little bit more for certain upper body movements, and training a little closer to failure, a rep in the tank or something like that for most lifts, and maybe sometimes to failure on an isolation movement. So that's the way I'd split it up. Again, it really does depend on your goal. Just real quick, if your goal is just to get really good at rucking and running and you're using strength training as a way to support it, I would probably do 2 sessions per week, and mostly upper body, a little bit of lower body. Maybe one day is a full upper body day. The next day is a full body day, and you touch on some lower body stuff just to mix it in as well. But it should be minimal lifting volume, still push the intensity so you're able to maintain strength and muscle at least. But you don't need to lift really any more than that. You should be totally fine. Next question, best pull-up and chin-up progression from 0. Yeah, so hopefully in an ideal world, you'll have access to an assisted pull-up machine, and you can do assisted pull-ups and assisted chin-ups. And every week, maybe every 2 weeks, or at least just over time, trend-wise, you should be looking to reduce the amount of assistance that you're getting. So say, for example, you can do 3 sets of 6 with 30 pounds of extra help. I would stick with 30 pounds until you're up to 8 reps. And then once you're up to 8 reps, drop 5 pounds, maybe 10 pounds off the resistance. And that should put you back at like 5 or 6. And then continue with that weight till you're up to 8 reps. And then drop another 5 to 10 pounds off until you're down to 0. And when you're hitting 6 to 8 reps with 5 pounds of extra resistance, you should be able to do at least a few reps with not resistance, but assistance. You should be able to do a few reps without any assistance, and slowly increase your rep count over time until you're getting up in the 10 to 12, maybe 15 dead hang range. And then you can start throwing some weight on. You can start doing weighted pull-ups. That's way down the road, but that's just an example of how I would progress that. Additionally, I would throw in some negatives where you use a box or a bench or something to get up into the chin above the bar position, the top position of a pull-up, and really slowly lower yourself for 5, 6, 7 seconds or so. That type of training is definitely going to help get you to where you can start doing actual pull-ups with body weight. It is a little bit fatiguing because that is the eccentric portion of the lift. That's the most fatiguing part of the movement. So you need to probably not do that every day, not do that several days per week. I would probably do that once or twice a week. I would probably do Chin-ups at least once or twice a week. I would also probably do pull-ups once or twice a week. Also, keep in mind that doing pull-ups too frequently or too close to failure or both is a little bit rough on most people's shoulders. So you want to really be mindful of how your shoulders feel. You want to switch grips up every so often, if not even more. You can switch grips up every week or two if you want. Doing a bunch of neutral grip chin-ups is still going to help with your pull-ups. Doing chin-ups is going to help with your pull-ups. Doing neutral grip chin-ups is going to help with your chin-ups. So you definitely should consider switching your grips up. Also, you could consider doing them on D handles or buying a pair of Angles 90s. That way your grip can rotate through the range of motion. Those are often way more favorable on a lot of people's shoulders and elbows. And it just is going to take some time of doing negatives, doing the assisted pull-ups till you're down to able to do a couple reps of bodyweight pull-ups. And then it's just a slow progression from there. But definitely very doable. Just takes a lot of persistence and frequency, but also being very mindful of how your shoulders and elbows are feeling and keeping that form locked in, controlling the eccentric and basic stuff like that. That is important for basically anyone on any lift, but definitely important for pull-ups because pull-ups are great, but they do cause a lot of people problems when done in excess. Next question, is it counterproductive to work muscle groups like the core and lower body if they are still sore? Sometimes, very context specific. So if your main goal is to get as jacked as possible, your main goal is hypertrophy, or I would say even strength, but more so hypertrophy, and you don't really care about any other type of training, all you're doing really is lifting, maybe a little cardio for health, but you're not doing a bunch of running and repeats and rucking and stuff like that. I personally would most of the time just allow for another day of recovery if you're still sore. If you're, say you hit legs Monday and they're still sore on Thursday, you normally hit legs Thursday, I would usually lean towards just hitting them Friday instead if they're still a little bit sore. But if you are trying to gain fitness in multiple different disciplines, say you're doing some sort of hybrid training approach, maybe you're trying to get better at running, you're also trying to get stronger, you're also trying to build some muscle, then you pretty much, without question, at some point are going to have to train while you're still sore. Now, there's different types of soreness. So if your muscle belly is sore, like the middle of your muscle, think of after a chest day, your chest is sore. That is different than joint soreness. It's different than distal or proximal soft tissue soreness. So, maybe your bicep is sore, but is it the middle of your bicep, or is it down near your elbow, or is it up near your shoulder? Those are all very different. Muscle belly soreness is usually fine to train through. Joint or soft tissue soreness or connective tissue soreness is usually something to take a little bit of precaution with, because that just usually means that your tendons, ligaments, joint structure is still under recovered, and those take longer to recover than muscles. And it just usually indicates that you're either doing too much, you're doing things with bad form, or you are making some sort of mistake that is not allowing you to train properly without joint soreness. So you want to be very mindful of what type of soreness you have. Another situation where training through a little bit of soreness is totally fine is when you're just starting a new block, or if you just introduced some new exercises to your program, or if you're just starting out training and you're sore. When you're more new, or if you just added a lift to your program that's just a little novel and it caused soreness, you can usually train through that the next time you train. Again, if it's like muscle belly soreness, the main reason you're sore there is because of the novel stimulus, whether it's because you are just new to training or it's because of a new exercise, a new range of motion. That should go away after a couple of weeks of training. That soreness maybe not completely go away, but it shouldn't last as long as it's lasting now after a couple of weeks, and you will no longer have to train through that soreness due to the repeated bout effect. So again, if you're doing a hybrid program, sometimes you're going to have sore legs from a run that you did yesterday or 2 days ago, and you're going to have to lift. Or if you lifted yesterday and you're doing a run today, you're going to have to run on some sore legs. That's totally expected and normal. But again, for pure hypertrophy goals, I would just allow another day of recovery and train something different. In most cases, it's probably not going to hurt you if you happen to train through a little bit of soreness one time. But in most cases, you want to kind of allow that full soreness to go away. So another case for hybrid training where I wouldn't train through soreness is if it's restricting your range of motion. If you're super duper sore, even if you're on a hybrid plan, you're supposed to train that day, and you can't even get into a full squat, for example, because your adductors are so sore or your quads are so sore, then I would push that training at least a day right and do something different. You can get some blood flow in the legs, do some walking, do some light cardio, not running. That can help a little bit, but in reality, it's just the biggest things that are going to allow soreness to go away is time, sleep, and nutrition. So all the other recovery hacks and recovery tools and recovery tips are not useless, but they're also not going to like completely flush out your soreness like a lot of people say they will. So hopefully that helps. Next question is, Jack Iselle a good program to run if you're in group wanting to get stronger and maintain run times? Yeah, that's pretty much exactly what it's created for. I followed some version of Jack Iselle throughout most of my career, and that is pretty much how I trained, with the addition of some agility and some jumping and some power training, and occasionally threw in some extra calisthenics if I knew I was going to be tested on some. But for the most part, I trained almost like that the entire time. And that's kind of the population that I had in mind when I created the program, was guys either in the Q course or in group that want to be jacked, strong, and good at running all at the same time. So yeah, absolutely would recommend it. I wouldn't recommend it just following it on repeat indefinitely, but that and T850 are both good programs for Q course guys, as well as for guys in group, or for really anyone who wants to get stronger and also improve their running ability. Next question, any specific training exercises to cut my 1.5 mile time from 10:21 to 9 minutes? So this is not a trivial gap between the time that you're at right now and the time that you want, primarily because you're already not brand new to running. If you're already running a 10:21, that's like just under 7 minute miles, probably 6:55-ish. That means that you're at least a somewhat established runner. Obviously you want to get better, but if you were running a 15-minute 1.5 mile and you wanted to get down to 13:30, it would take a completely different amount of time to get there, just because there's more room to grow. When you're more of a beginner, the slower it is, the more of a delta there's going to be between your run times. But since you're already at 10:21, you're running 6:55 miles and you want to get down to 9, that's a 6-minute mile pace. That is a pretty big gap. So before I get into what I think you should do, definitely manage your expectations and don't expect this to happen in 3 weeks or 4 weeks or 5 weeks. I would say if you follow a really good program and you take recovery seriously and you're not training for a bunch of other different fitness disciplines at the same time, realistically, this might take you 3 months or so at the very least, maybe a little bit less. But in most cases, just because of the way people usually train, it might take you 4 months, 5 months, a little bit longer. It really depends on a lot of factors, to include your genetic propensity towards running. And if you've been fast before and you're getting back into it, it might be a lot faster of a process for you. But just a little expectation management before I get into it. So your main focus should be on interval training. So you can get up to where you're doing intervals at least twice a week. You might even be able to finagle your way to 3 per week, but I would probably start with 1, see how that goes for a little while, then go up to 2, and then see how that goes for a little while, maybe 3. It really depends on a lot of the other training that you're doing, but you want to keep the intensity high, the volume low. You don't want to be doing 800-meter repeats. You don't want to be doing 12 400-meter repeats. That's just excessive. That's more like 5 mile training. So you want to keep the repeat volume, generally speaking, 1.5 miles or less. But you really want to focus on quality and running repeats as they were intended to be run, which is in the name, repeats, instead of doing what most people do and just going as hard as they can on every single one. And therefore, once their fatigue sets in after a few reps, they just start dropping off, and each repeat slower and slower and slower. So what I would do is pick a pace that is somewhere in between your current pace, which is, again, 6:55-ish, 6:56, and your goal pace, which is 6 minutes per mile. The reason I wouldn't have you run at your goal pace, a lot of people say just run repeats at your goal pace. Well, yeah, that can be appropriate. But if your goal pace is almost a minute per mile faster than your current pace, then that's too fast to run your repeats to start out. So I would run repeats at around a 6:35, maybe 6:45 pace to start out, and then slowly increase the pace over time. So the main repeat distances that I would shoot for would be 200-meter repeats, some 400-meter repeats, occasionally maybe some 600s, 800s, but the lower distance repeats is usually best for your 2 mile time. For your 1.5 or 2 mile time, both would apply. So I would do a bunch of 200 meter repeats, a bunch of 400 meter repeats. And I don't mean a bunch by like a bunch per session, but those are what I would focus on most. So say, for example, 1 week, you've worked your way up to 2 repeat sessions per week. Maybe you're doing one on Monday, one on Thursday. Maybe Monday is going to be 6 400 meter repeats at a 6:35 pace or 6:40 pace. 1-to-1 work to rest. I would slowly work your way towards not taking a complete rest. So what that would mean is, say your 400 takes a minute 35 because you're running it at that 6:35, 6:40 pace. I don't know exactly what it would take, but it's probably 135 to 138 or something like that. Say it takes that and you are resting 1-to-1. So you'd rest about the same. You could probably rest 130. At first, your rest period should just be like easy walking around, pacing around. Over time, you want to either manipulate the duration of the rest period. So maybe after a couple of weeks, you cut it down to 115, then maybe a couple more weeks, 1 minute, or you could adjust what you do during that rest period and make it an incomplete rest. So maybe the first 45 seconds of it, you walk, and then the last 45 going into your next lap, you do a light jog. So you're not getting like a full rest, but you're still hitting that pace. It should be very doable after you put a couple weeks under your belt. And then say Thursday, you do 10 200 meter repeats. That gives you what? 2,000 meters of volume. That's like a mile and a quarter. Maybe you do 12 200 meter repeats and you progress from there. Each week you want to adjust 1, maybe 2 variables. You could adjust the rest time. You could adjust your pace. You could adjust the volume. Maybe you start with a mile of volume. Then 2 weeks later, you do a mile and a half of volume, whatever it may be. Or you could adjust the distance of the intervals that you're running. So those will be your bread and butter. You can also do some hill work, some hill repeats, 30 second to 1 minute hill repeats every so often, maybe as a replacement for one of the interval sessions, just because it's lower impact and less stressful. You can also do some tempo work at a little bit faster than your current pace. So maybe you do like an 8-minute tempo run, which is a couple minutes shorter than what you're currently running for the 2 mile. So, but you should do it close to your current pace. So maybe 650 or 653 pace or something like that for the tempo, or you can do tempo intervals as well. But tempo runs are not quite as important for this short distance, but they definitely still can be done. But you don't want to be doing 15, 20, 25-minute tempo runs. You want to keep them short and you want to keep them pretty fast around your race pace, maybe a little bit faster, and slowly inch your way up to doing slightly longer durations. Maybe you start with a 6-minute tempo run. Then next week you do an 8-minute. Then the next week you do 10, maybe up to 12 at the most. And then slowly over time, maybe not week to week, but slowly over time, you want to trend to running those tempo runs a little bit faster. As for long distance stuff, you don't really have to do a ton of long runs, but you absolutely can do long runs. You maybe do a long run per week, but the long runs don't have to be, 90 minutes, 2 hours, 2.5 hours, stuff like that. They can be 45 minutes to an hour. Again, you don't need like a ton of volume for this duration of running, but you want enough volume, but you really want to focus on running fast. You want to focus on recovery, make sure you're not running yourself into the ground, get slower every week. And yeah, just expect it to take a few months at the minimum and continue to train consistently and hard. Next question, if doing SFAS prep after Jacked Gazelle, would you suggest alternating rucks and runs for the long zone 2 session? So I think I answered this differently on Instagram. I thought he was talking about the long ruck that is programmed in SFAS every weekend. So I'll answer it the way that I think he's actually talking about it, which is in Jacked Gazelle, the weekend session, the long run or ruck or whatever you want to do is basically it's optional which modality you choose. So would he benefit from doing rucks every other weekend instead of just doing runs every weekend as he finishes Jacked Gazelle going into SFAS prep, knowing that he's going to be rucking more in SFAS prep? Yeah, that could be an absolutely totally fine way to do it. A couple rucks per month is a great way to maintain your rucking ability and maybe even build your rucking ability as you get into a more ruck specific program, a more selection specific program. So I absolutely would do something like that. You don't necessarily have to. You could just run. But if you aren't super experienced with a ruck, or if you're not super happy with your rucking ability, or you need a little bit of extra rucking ability, maybe you're doing pretty well on runs, then you definitely can add some rucks. I wouldn't do a ruck every weekend necessarily, unless you're just walking, then that's totally fine. But you're also going to miss out a little bit. If you also want to be good at running, you probably want to get some running in at least some of the time on those weekends. But yeah, that would be a totally fine option. Definitely recommended. You'll probably start with a better rucking ability when you start SFAS prep than you would if you just ran every single weekend. So send it. Next question, low back bulletproofing tips. Have already suffered a herniated disc. No more, please. Yeah, so I'm not a physical therapist. I'm not a doctor. So take everything I say with a grain of salt. But lower back is a super common place to have injuries, pain, etc. for a lot of people. And there's so many different potential causes of it. For example, a lot of people have herniated discs like you do, and they don't even know it because it doesn't cause pain. Other people don't have herniated discs, and on x-ray and assessment, nothing really looks wrong, but they have a ton of pain. And these people aren't usually lying. They're usually in pain. So it's very complicated is what I'm trying to say. And also, just to get this out of the way, bulletproofing is not a real thing. I know it's a marketing term. They're not using it literally, but a lot of people will say bulletproof your knees, bulletproof your hips, bulletproof your back, bulletproof your shoulders, whatever. There's no way to completely make it so that it's uninjurable and indestructible. So with that out of the way, what would I do? Assuming you can do hinges and assuming that you can do back flexion and back extension movements with minimal to no pain, I would really focus on strengthening your back. I would really focus on strengthening your core, but you want to focus on like specific things. So doing heavy hinges, whether it's a deadlift, RDL, stiff-legged deadlift, good mornings, things like that. Those will really beef up your erectors. They'll also beef up your glutes and your hamstrings, which are also important to make it so that your lower back's not doing all the work. Your bigger, stronger, less prone to injury glutes are taking some of that work as well. You want to really focus on a well-executed hinge. Hinge movements are simple in theory, but they are not simple in practice. A lot of people struggle with hinging. One thing that I commonly see I'll talk about two things that I commonly see with hinging in client assessments and stuff like that. One is when they do any sort of Romanian deadlift, whatever it may be, they seem to do them as if they're on the clock, like they're going for time. And this is very common in former CrossFitters because most of the lifts that you do are on the clock. And the faster you get through 10 reps, 12 reps, whatever it may be, the better you're going to do in that workout. That is not a very good way to train if you want to strengthen your back. It's not a very good way to train if you have a history of back injuries. It's not a good way to train if you want to strengthen your glutes and beef up your glutes and your hamstrings and whatnot. You want to slow down the eccentric. You should be thinking fight gravity as you lower the bar. On any of these hinge movements that you're doing, you don't necessarily have to count to an arbitrary number. I think that's too much to have in someone's head, especially when they're doing a hinge, which is a complicated movement and there's a lot to think about. But you want to think fight gravity, because if you don't, it's going to be mostly a momentum based. Obviously, if you're holding a barbell and you bend over, the barbell is going to pull you down. And if you don't fight it, the barbell is just going to fall and your back's going to kind of go with it. And a lot of people will not really create a lot of tension in that lowering portion of the movement. And therefore, usually they end up with non-existent glutes, non-existent hamstrings, and a sore back. So definitely nice, slow, controlled, really work on that hip hinge. When your butt stops moving backwards, that's the end of the range of motion. That's when you come back up. You can do a pause if you want in that bottom position and really get a feel for it. And then you come back up. So lots of hinging. If loaded hinging is bothersome for your back, you can do some hinging with your legs locked in. So a 45-degree back raise is excellent. You can make 45-degree back raise mostly a lower back movement. You can make it mostly a glute movement. You can make it mostly a hamstring movement, but it's going to work all three of those kind of depending on how you execute it. It definitely takes some skill, but that is another great way to do it. And it's usually a little bit healthier on a lot of people's back. You want to strengthen your core for sure. You want to do some rotational movements. You want to do some abdominal hypertrophy movements. You also want to do some plank variations and some carry variations, single arm carry variations to get your QL muscle, which is a deep muscle in the lower back that not a lot of exercises really target. But when you do contralateral loaded carries, so like say you're doing a suitcase carry with a kettlebell, the opposite side QL is working to stabilize and keep your upper body straight. So those are all great ways to strengthen your upper back or your lower back, but you also want to strengthen the lats. You want to strengthen your upper back. You don't want to just stop at the lower back. And most of those movements definitely will involve the upper back, but obviously rows and pull down variations are going to be the finishing touches on strengthening that upper back and lats and mid back and stuff like that. So that is what I would recommend for the most part. definitely stay mobile, keep your hips mobile, lots of hip mobility, 90-90s, deep squats, lift with full range of motion. And if it continues to bother you, definitely go see a specialist and have them get their hands on you and actually check it out. But there is hope. There are plenty of guys who have great careers in SF. There's plenty of guys getting after it in real life with super messed up backs. And you kind of just got to find your way around it and not train through too much pain and take it slow. Really focus on form, really focus on execution and choosing the right exercises. Next question, how do you plan volume and intensity percentage drop on a running deload? Do you cut out all non-zone 2? It depends. There are lots of different ways to deload running. I have found that running intensity is more fatiguing and more stressful than running volume for the majority of people. So for example, if you are running mostly zone 2, even if you're running a lot of volume, it's going to be less fatiguing than if you're doing a lot of intervals and a lot of thresholds, a lot of hill repeats, etc. So you definitely want to cut down at minimum on intensity, but I would also cut a little volume down as well. So this would be a perfectly fine way to do it. Just do zone 2 for the week, or even shorten your zone 2 runs and do 2 or 3 of them. It really depends on what you're doing going in, but I don't usually use a certain percentage. I personally give most of my clients every 4 to 6 weeks, depending on how they're doing, a non-repeat week, a non-speed running week. So they don't do a repeat session that week or a tempo run or a threshold run. They just do non-running cardio, or they'll just hit easy runs, maybe with a few pickups throughout those runs or strides afterwards, but that's not like real speed work. So it does depend on how much you're running right now. It depends on how you're feeling. It depends on why you're taking the deload. Is it just a planned deload, or is it a reactive deload because you're feeling messed up? Those would be different as well. Oftentimes, you can just take 3 to 4 days off, train minimally for 3 to 4 days overall, not just running, but like in general. And that is sufficient for a lot of people. It really depends on the situation. But the example that you mentioned, just sticking to zone 2 throughout the week and probably cutting volume down by 25, 30% or so is a totally fine option. You could even cut it down to 50%. It just depends on what you're going for, how you're feeling, and why you're taking that deload. So that would be my best recommendation there. Next question. In your opinion, what age range does the typical man physically peak? TF Voodoo said mid-30s. Yeah, so for those living under a rock, TF Voodoo is Dr. David Walton, selection expert, former Green Beret, great dude. And I largely agree with that. It really does depend on what you are talking about physically. This is assuming you've been training most of your adult life and you're actually, you haven't taken 7 years off, or you just didn't stop training when you were 18, because if that was the case, then when you stopped training was your prime, regardless of what age it was. But assuming you've been training, usually your peak power and potentially strength, but more so power and speed, will occur early 20s, maybe mid 20s, maybe even late teens for some people. So that's like vertical jump height, your speed and quickness, your 60-meter sprint, things along those lines. When we're talking about muscle hypertrophy, being as jacked as possible, and or endurance, longer duration endurance, that's when we start moving into the 30s. Early 30s, mid 30s, maybe even late 30s for some people are their best years for making muscle gains. Muscle takes a long time to gain. So you start training, say at 15. At 25, you probably have not maxed out your muscle gain yet. If you have been training consistently and you continue to train for another 10, 12 years and you don't have any like serious hormone issues or other health issues, you're probably going to be more jacked at 35 than you are at 25. Endurance wise, a lot of the best endurance runners in the world are in their 30s. So it does depend on what discipline we're talking about, but usually you're not going to run your fastest 40-meter dash at 35. You're not going to have your highest vertical jump at 35, unless of course you didn't train in your 20s and you just started training for that stuff. Or if you train differently in your 20s. And for me, for example, I've never really trained for like maximum vertical leap. I've never trained to be as fast as humanly possible in the 40-meter dash. So if I were to start training like that, which I'm not really going to, I do like jumping and I do jump quite often just for power and maintenance of fast twitch muscle fibers, but I don't have like a goal of dunking again or anything like that. I probably could get to where my vertical leap was higher than it was in my 20s because I didn't train like that back then. I could probably get to where I am able to run a faster 40-meter dash or 60-meter dash than I could in my 20s because I didn't train like that back then. So it depends on what you're going for. But at the same time, most people, for the audience that I talk to, who are interested in endurance, a little bit of strength, a little bit of muscle, and overall athletic performance, if you're in your 30s, you still absolutely have the potential to hit your peak. However, usually after college, people's lives change drastically in regards to their obligations and their outside of training activities. So the average person doesn't really train hard and doesn't train for physical performance late into their 20s, into their 30s, etc. So of course you still have to train. There are plenty of 35-year-old men who are in the worst shape of their entire lives. And that just is usually because they drink a lot, they don't sleep, they eat shit, they don't actually train, they don't train consistently, and they do a bunch of other shit that's just not good for health or performance. So a lot of nuance there, a lot of different contexts in which you could make arguments for multiple different ages, but I would say 30s for some things, 20s for other things. But either way, there's still hope. If you have goals, athletic goals, regardless of what they are, and you're in your 30s, or if you're in your 40s, or if you're in your 50s, you can still go for it. That doesn't necessarily, there's no cutoff age for everyone where you just stop. There are people who don't lift for the first 80 years of their lives, and they start lifting when they're 80, and they gain muscle and strength and health. They live longer because of it. So it's never too late. Just get training whenever and chase your goals, because, you know, if you restrict yourself to some certain age where you start telling yourself certain things are impossible or unreachable, then you're just going to put that limiter on yourself and you're not going to get there anyway. So that would be my best advice for that. Next question. Do most officers who go through the Q course have far better run times than others? I'm not a runner. In my experience, officers are usually pretty solid runners, but it's not like a set in stone, black and white thing. Blanket statement, all O's are fast. That's just not the case. As a population, usually officers are a little more on the fit side than in general the enlisted population, especially like in the Q course. But that doesn't mean there are no exceptions. If you're not fast, as long as you're fast enough to meet the standards at selection and in the Q course, then you want to leverage your other strengths, because running speed, although it's way too highly valued by the Army in general, typically if you're fast at running, you are like God's gift to the Army, which is a little bit ridiculous, but it is a thing. There are also other things that matter in regards to being an officer, especially being in the Q course and being a successful Green Beret. So again, so long as you're fast enough to meet the standards and you are also decently strong, you can ruck well, you can lead men, you are a good face of the team, you don't look like a fat piece of shit, you don't look sloppy, because you are going to be when you get to group, you're going to be the face of the team. Even though you're only going to do a short period of time, relatively speaking, on a team as an officer, you're still the facing part of the team. You're going to be in charge of getting your team the missions that you guys want. You're going to be in charge of briefing the higher command. You want to look the part. Regardless, not just officers, everyone. I think this is important for everyone. But so long as you can perform physically, and so long as you are confident, you have the ability to lead men, you don't have a tendency to go in and try to change a bunch of things that are already working, but now that you're in charge, you're going to go ahead and change it. Interpersonal skills, very important. Character, all these things are things to focus on if you're not great at running. Definitely focus on running, try to get a little better at it over time. Everyone can get better at running by training for it. But if you are not blazing 30-minute 5 miles and 11:32 miles, you're going to be okay. Just put the work in, leverage your strengths, work on your weaknesses, bring them up, but also don't feel like you're a failure if you can't beat everyone in runs just because you're an officer, and officers are supposed to be fast. So that's my best advice to you. Next question is a thoughts on question, but I'm still going to answer it because this is something I'm very passionate about. I actually made a post about yesterday, and it needs a little bit more explanation. All right, so thoughts on programs that don't include rucking due to high taxation on connective tissue. Yeah, so I'm assuming he's talking about programs that are preparing people for a ruck-based selection, like a selection prep program, not just a program in general, because, you know, programs in general usually don't have rucking in them. But assuming he's talking about that, which I'm pretty sure he is, there are programs out there, there are philosophies out there in which people have the stance that rucking is not something that should be done super often, even if prepping for a ruck-based selection, because of the stress on the joints, the soft tissue, and because rucking is known to cause injuries in a lot of people. My stance is, if you're preparing for a selection where almost every single pass-fail event occurs with a ruck on, you should absolutely ruck more. Any form of training, whether it's lifting weights, running, or rucking, is always going to cause some sort of stress to the joints, the nervous system, the musculature, the bones, psychological stress. There's going to be a stress component. That is the nature of training. Additionally, when done appropriately, when approached in a reasonable manner, the stress that you're subjecting yourself to with these training sessions is recovered from and adapted to. And therefore, in the future, you're able to handle this stress and even more stress over time. So whether that's running, whether that's going and squatting, you're going to subject your lower body joints to stress, your soft tissue, your connective tissue. And when done in a sound, appropriate, progressive manner, that stress is a good thing to expose yourself to, because you're going to recover from it, you're going to adapt to it, and you're going to be better able to handle it. So if you're going to a ruck-based selection, you're going to have a ruck on almost all the time, and you spend very little time in your prep wearing a ruck because you are worried about all the stress that it was going to cause. Well, guess what? When you go to that selection, you're going to get handed a big pile of stress from rucking. And if you haven't adapted to that over time, you, regardless, even if your train up was ruck heavy, you're still going to be put in a situation where your stress is going to outweigh your recovery and your adaptation at selection. That's just the nature of it. It's built to break you down. But you're going to have a higher ceiling from which to fall if you have already subjected yourself to that stress in your train up, as opposed to rucked very minimally, done plenty of running, done plenty of lifting, done a little bit of rucking, but then you go and do 3 weeks straight of rucking, and it's going to be a big time shock to you. So if your goal is just to get by and just pass, just maybe finish middle of the pack, maybe a little slower, maybe a little faster. For most people, there are people who don't need to ruck much, who are just freak athletes that can pass a ruck-based selection even with minimal rucking. But for most people, this is not the case. But if your goal is just to get by and, do all right, and maybe blade run, maybe be a little anxious the entire time about your overall performance, if it was good enough or not, then I would say you could probably test the waters by following a program that has minimal rucking in it. If your goal is to go and smash it to the best of your ability, everything, all the gates, all the runs, all the rucks, the PT test, land nav, the team week, everything, most of those things occur with a ruck on, by the way. But if that's your goal, then you definitely should ruck in your prep. I personally think chasing your best showing, your best performance that you possibly can, is what makes the whole process worth it. So if your goal is just to get by and your goal is to, fly under the radar and show up, not put yourself at risk in training a little bit, or if you have a very fragile attitude, you just believe that you're very injury prone, then yeah, maybe shy away from rucking a little bit. But I don't think that is really a fruitful way to approach any sort of goal. It doesn't stop at selection. If your mentality is to just get by things, and you get by selection, you skate through the Q course, and then your mentality when you show up to group is just, I'm just going to do enough to get by. People like that, you don't want people like that on your team. That is not the soft mentality. That's not the mentality of someone who is driven and determined and always looking to improve themselves in any real area of life. This is not just fitness. It's really anything. If that's your attitude, then I don't understand how that would be a fulfilling way to live. So all this to say is, by rucking more in selection prep, yes, you're subjecting yourself to a little bit more risk. You're subjecting yourself to a little bit more joint stress and connective tissue stress. But when done properly, when programmed properly, and when the volume and intensity and the load is increased in a reasonable manner, anything can be adapted to. Anything. Any sort of training can be. There are people who ruck every single day, and guess what? They're okay. The reason rucking usually gets blamed for injuries is because most people don't approach rucking properly. They either start ruck running too soon. They don't build a running base before they start rucking. They don't do a lot of ruck walking before they start ruck running. They don't spend enough time building a base of strength in the gym, or they start with too high a volume. They start with too much load. They start with too much intensity, or they just don't ruck ever, and they go and launch themselves into a 12-miler like regular Army conventional units might do a quarterly 12-miler, and guys won't train for it, and they'll show up and go all out in a 12-miler and finish maybe just under 3 hours, and then they'll be messed up for 4 weeks or longer, or they just have injuries that never go away because they don't prepare for things and they show up unprepared for that stress because they haven't adapted to it, and they end up with injuries and they end up getting disability. So blaming rucking itself is incredibly short-sighted. And usually people who do this, they just heard from someone somewhere, sometime, that rucking was bad. So they go with it. Or they see a study where people are subjected to rucking, or it's an observational study that they follow units around or whatever, and they assess the injury rates. But what they're not assessing is the lack of preparation that went into these rucks, the lack of exposure to that stress that they never adapted to, so that when they are made to ruck, they're forced march without any preparation. Yeah, of course they're going to hurt themselves. I've looked several times long and hard through the entire annals of the internet for a study that shows that properly programmed and properly executed rucking with reasonable increases in volume, intensity, load over time, sufficient recovery, all things that you should be doing anyway during your selection prep with all of your training, not just your rucking. I've never seen a study that shows even when you do that, you're still going to hurt yourself rucking. Rucking is a higher risk exercise than certain other exercises, but it also can be adapted to. It can be done right. It can be done without injury. And if you want to show up to a fucking ruck-based selection and crush it, you probably should ruck. That is what I'm going to leave it at. As you can tell, this gets me very riled up, but that is the end of my rant on that one. Hopefully that makes sense. I highly suggest rucking at least once a week, preferably 2, maybe for some people, if going to certain selections, maybe 3 times a week, and you will be a lot better off. And you'll be okay if you do it properly and if you do it in a well-programmed, well-structured manner. So that is it. Last question. Thank you guys very much for listening today. I'll be back soon with another episode. Until then, Terminator out.